Hi everyone, Ariel here. I am going to be starting a series today on word definitions. So to explain, these are going to be a series of short videos talking about terms that are commonly used in public discourse here in the US that are often not well defined or not understood. There are a lot of different terms that are bandied around by both sides of the political aisle here in the United States that are used ignorantly, and people use them sometimes as slurs against the opposite side, or sometimes they may be using them to defend their position, but they don't really explain what they mean by it, sometimes because they don't know, and sometimes because they do, but they assume the other person has the same definition of the term as they do, and that's often not the case, so a lot of confusion can occur. Hopefully what I just said will become a little bit clearer as we get into these actual videos. So today we're going to be talking about the term individual right and natural right. So the two are actually interchangeable in history in the US. If you go back all the way to the founding, they are interchangeable, so we're going to talk about them as basically one and the same thing, but just know, as we're getting started here, that typically here in the States, the common rhetorical term we use now is individual liberty or individual rights. So I get a lot of questions about this from people where they're saying, well, Ariel, how can you proclaim individual rights and then turn around and also look at somebody else with a different opinion and deride the opinion or even the person? So I get a lot of questions about how it's not hypocritical to say, oh, I support individual rights, and then not support every opinion under the sun, basically, to mock or even disdain different opinions or potentially even people who hold them. I hold a little bit of a stricter view on when it's acceptable to deride the person who holds them. That has more to do with whether the person has made it clear that they genuinely support this, and if the position is an evil one, then okay, yeah, it would be acceptable at that point to call that person what they are. But that aside, the point here today is to explain what an individual right or a natural right actually is, because that's going to clear up a lot of the confusions that I see occurring in public discourse, as well as in conversations that I've had with other people who don't understand what the term means. So first of all, let's go ahead and give the definition. So underneath the typical definition or the historical definition of a right is something that is inherent to you as a person, as a member of humanity. It is something that is not granted to you, but is instead inherent to the fact that you are a human being. It is something that you are able to exercise, short of tyranny and force preventing you from doing so, without anyone else having to exercise it, and even if others are exercising it at the same time. So basically, a right is something that you are able to do simultaneously with someone else doing the same action, and neither of you would have to force the other to quit doing what they are in order for one of you to be able to exercise that right. So if you have to force the other person to stop doing something or force them to do something in order for you to be able to take a specific action or have a specific thing, then it is no longer a right. So under that definition of rights, then, it should become pretty clear that it's not about the opinions someone else holds. Now, we would say that everyone has a right to hold their own opinion. That's where the idea of free speech sort of extends from and originates from is this idea that every individual has the right to think as they please and the right to express that opinion freely and without fear of harm. But that does not mean that you have a right to my respect or my listening ear or my approval, right? Because under our definition of right, if you had a right to that, you'd have to force me to go against my own opinions and my own beliefs. So we both have a right to hold our own opinions and to hold our own beliefs. We both have a right to express those. Both of us can do that at the same time without forcing the other person to, express a view or not express a view in general. Like, the two viewpoints can clash completely or agree, but we can both express them while the other person is doing that as well. Neither of us needs the other person to basically shut up in order for us to be able to express what we think, right? So whether they listen or not, we are able to actually express ourselves and express our opinions. But we're not both simultaneously able to claim an audience, right? Because that then requires consent from the other person to actually engage with you. And that's where you get the right of free association, right? We have a right to choose who we are and are not going to associate with. We cannot be forced to be friends with someone or forced to do business with someone. So since we have that right of free association, you can't claim a right to an audience because that would remove my right to free association, or not remove, because I would still possess the right. It's inherent to the fact that I'm human, but it would infringe upon my ability to exercise that right. You could freely associate with anyone you chose, but if you were to turn around and force the other person to associate with you, then they are no longer able to freely associate. So now it's not a right for you to be able to make them interact with you. That would be a display of force. So we kind of need to keep that in mind when we're talking about what is a right and what is not a right. Generally speaking, if you have to use force, whether it's the force of law or physical threats of violence, regardless of what form that force may take, if you have to use force in order to get what you want from someone else, then what you are doing and the so-called right that you're exercising is not, in fact, a right. So I want to take a moment as we're closing here. I've given the definition. I've talked a little bit about some different examples of what would be considered a right and what wouldn't and why. But I want to go ahead and take a look at some primary source material from the founding period. Before the founding period in this case. So during the founding period, when our founders were writing our Constitution, which was a document intended to protect the rights inherent to us. It was not to grant the rights, okay? The Constitution does not grant us those rights. We have those rights as human beings. The Constitution is merely there in order to ensure that our government does not have the capability to simply step in and infringe on those rights or remove them from us, right? So we have to understand that first. The document is not intended to grant rights because no government can grant rights under a natural rights and individualistic rights perspective. They're inherent to you. So the government can certainly abridge your ability to exercise those rights by way of force, but they cannot remove from you the actual right. And that's why we call it tyranny when they do that. Because they're essentially removing from you something that you do inherently possess and treating you as though you are less than human. So the Constitution was predicated on this idea of natural law. And this is why I say that the idea of individual rights and natural law or natural rights went hand in hand back during the founding when our Constitution was being written. And the terminology that the founders used was the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, this meant something extremely specific. During this time period, many of the founders were lawyers, and one of the things that the lawyers at the time would do was to, before they could become a practicing lawyer themselves, they had to read law as an apprentice with a practicing lawyer. So that was the requirement. You had a certain amount of time that you had to read law in order to fulfill the requirements for you to practice law. And reading law literally just means exactly what it sounds like. They were reading law. And during that time period, the majority of the law commentaries that they were reading were from William Blackstone. And that is where the phrase law of nature and of nature's God, or revealed law of nature, came from. So the founders in the Constitution were actually going back to terms that Blackstone used to describe natural rights and what law really is and how it's meant to protect those natural rights. So I think that it would be a good place to close today by looking at some quotes that showcase what these ideas were that they were basing the Constitution on. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at a couple of quotes from Blackstone. The first one that I want to take a look at is from his introduction to his commentaries. Now, the commentaries, or as they're sometimes known, the commentaries on English law, they go by several names, but the commentaries by William Blackstone is generally what people recognize, if they even recognize the name at all. In the introduction to that commentary, which is a 5-volume set, he starts out by talking about natural law and the definition of that term as the basis for all other law. And he makes an important point when he's talking about this. Okay, so one of the things that he says in the beginning when he's talking about natural law and the law of nature, as he puts it, or the laws of the Creator, he says that man must necessarily be subject to the laws of his Creator. This will of his Maker is called the law of nature. This law of nature is, of course, superior to any other. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force from this original. He also goes on to discuss this in more detail and to discuss how natural rights are derived from this concept. For example, he states when discussing what these natural laws are, he says that such among others are these principles: that we should live honestly, should hurt nobody, and should render to everyone his due. So what we kind of understand out of this is the idea that, first of all, living honestly, this idea that you're not a thief, you're not stealing, you're living by honest means. And in that is encapsulated then, if you look at how those two extend from each other, the natural right that would correspond to the natural law of living within your means and not being a thief would be that you have a right to property. Because there is no such thing as theft if you don't have any personal property. There is nothing for anyone else to steal from you. So if we're going to say that the natural law that we see in nature and in God's revealed law, as Blackstone is saying here, is that we should live honestly and therefore not rob our neighbor of anything, then that would be the idea that we do have a right to personal property, because you can't have one without the other. And then, he goes on to say shouldn't hurt anybody. So this idea that we have a right to our life. We have a right, in a sense, to not have to be faced with threat of violence. So the laws that proceed out of that in a society would be laws to protect each individual citizen from harm by their neighbor. This idea of a right of self-defense stems from this idea that natural law states that we should not be hurting other people, that we should not be, conducting violence on others, essentially. So if we're going to say you don't have a right to inflict violence on someone else because natural law states that you should not, then we would also say that conversely, the person who is being victimized at the moment by that infringement on natural law would have a right to do something about it. They don't have to just sit there and take it. And that idea of that right to self-defense would go hand in hand with the idea that we have a right to bear arms, which ended up in the Constitution, obviously, because they recognized that the right to self-defense means you have to ensure that the means to self-defense are protected. And then they say should render to everyone his due. So again, you're fulfilling contractual obligations. So you're not able to just, if you owe someone something, you have to pay it back. So you don't have a right to just decide, I did business with you, I did this or I did that, I owe you this, I'm not going to pay it. Conversely, that means then that the other person on the other side of the contract has a right to expect that you fulfill your contractual obligations. So we've got tort law because of that. So if we look at this idea of natural law and the idea that this is a moral law that we see in nature and through Scripture, which in other places Blackstone said was that the Bible was the basis of common law in England and always has been regarded as part of the common law. So not just that it was the basis for it, but that it was literally considered part of the common law of England. So the Bible itself was considered part of the law that you needed to follow. So the Ten Commandments and things like that would be more what that's mainly referring to, but they took it as the Bible was their moral guidebook for how life ought to be lived, because if you believe in natural rights and individual rights in this perspective, then you're saying, okay, nature's creator then, who set the laws of nature into motion, gets to dictate what is moral and what is not moral. So you can see how this definition of individual rights and this definition based off of history, based off of what our founders actually believed and what they meant when they wrote the Constitution, you can see that it really is this idea or this basis of we're grounding individual rights in human rights as a whole based off of natural law. So there is a law that we see revealed in nature, such as live honestly, don't steal. And there is a corresponding right that is considered a natural or an individual right that is inherent to mankind. And that corresponding one in that example would be the right to property. So essentially they're linking these two together, and they did not believe that you could extricate one from the other. They believed you must have natural law and a creator as the underlying basis for individual rights, or else you lost the entire reason why you had those rights to begin with, and eventually you would lose those rights entirely. So under that basis, then perhaps it makes more sense how I might say to those who ask me, is it hypocritical to support individual rights while also turning around and saying that certain opinions and ideas are not valid, or that certain people who express them are acting foolishly, or in some cases legitimately calling them, whatever terminology fits with whatever philosophy they've espoused, whether it's Marxist, communist, socialist, fascist. There's all these different terms we use in political society today that we leverage against political opponents, sometimes quite fairly. And when it's fair, I would say that when you are not making a claim that is dishonest and when it is proven out by the person's ideas, there is zero clash whatsoever between this idea of individual rights and deriding or mocking something. Now, is that always the most effective way to go about it? No, absolutely not. Of course not. Making fun of something doesn't always get the point across as well as you would hope. It's usually best to focus on the idea and actually showing why that idea is bad rather than mocking it openly. But there are certain circumstances under which that may be appropriate. So all that to say, in wrapping up, the main question is stemming from the fact that people don't understand what individual rights actually means. So hopefully with this video, you guys understand a little bit better exactly what is meant by individual rights. Our upcoming videos, I will be trying to keep them roughly between 10 to 15 minutes. Some of them might be a little bit longer depending on what we have to get into in order to unpack the definition of a term, but I'm going to try to roughly keep them to 10 to 15 minutes and then potentially take some of that content and put the most important stuff into YouTube Shorts for those of you who want to watch them really quickly and you don't care about all the supporting quotes, you just want the main point and argument. So for those people, I may be looking into doing some YouTube Shorts later, but for now, we're just going to aim for 10 to 15 minute videos, and I hope that I will see you all next time.